I'm here with the fourth round analysis of the candidates tournament. In this video, we'll watch the game between Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and Alexander Grischuk. After 3 rounds, Maxime Lagrave had 1 win and 2 draws. Grischuk, on the other hand, is tied in all his games. I'd like to make a quick reminder before we begin the game. Our channel has a join button, as you may be aware. Donations from our friends can help me and our channel. After this quick reminder, let's move on to our game. The French Grandmaster starts the game with the e4 move as usual. The Russian Grandmaster's response is e5. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, Spanish opening. With bishop b5, the whites want to keep up the pressure on their opponent's center, with bishop takes c6, and then knight takes e5 threats at every moment of the game. As you know, the main move of the black here is a6. Grischuk's choice in the game was the knight f6 Berlin defense, which is known for its robustness. Instead of protecting the e5 pawn, the blacks chose to attain their opponent's center e4 pawn. Players who have recently played with the white pieces usually don't want to enter the main variant and block it with the d3 move. Because there was a threat of knight takes e4 that the blacks put forward. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, on the other hand, is one of the few players that has never shielded away from and even enjoys playing the main continuation of the Berlin defense. That doesn't change in this game either, and we see a kingside castling move from Maxime Lagrave. It's a temporary pawn sacrifice. And now Grischuk has continued the game with knight takes e4. If the whites wanted to, they could take advantage of the precision of the e vertical to retake their pawn with the rook e1 without too much difficulty. They can do it anyway. In the game, however, Maxime Lagrave's d4 is a far more ambitious continuation. First of all, the whites want to make the pawn exchange in e5, which will give them a significant space advantage. Of course, at this point, the blacks' e takes d4 move would be countered with rook e1, and the knight would have been in a very dangerous pin. That's why d4 versus knight d6. The blacks both wanted to take their opponent's valuable Spanish bishop, and with the knight no longer pinned, the blacks could make the e takes d4 in safer conditions. To avoid giving it an opportunity, the whites quickly continue with the bishop takes c6 move. D takes c6 from Grischuk, the main move. Sure, the blacks could play b takes c6, but d takes c6 is the most preferable move for blacks. With this capture, the blacks prepared the queen's bishop's development and opened the d-line. This is because the blacks can provide an easier, quick equalization strategy in Berlin defense by opening the d vertical and exchanging queens. Now, after d takes c6, Maxime Lagrave continues with d takes e5. As we said, he made this exchange with a pawn to gain more space. And now, knight f5. If the whites don't want to exchange the queens again, they can play queen e2. Although the whites have significant positional advantages that they can achieve by exchanging the queens. Usually, the queen takes d8 move is made here. That's what Maxime Lagrave did. King takes d8. This is the main position of the Berlin defense. As for the advantages of the whites, They have a very nice solid space advantage thanks to the e5 pawn. At the same time, the whites' 4-3 pawn majority on the king side may give them the opportunity to create passing pawns in the future by mobilizing this multiplicity of pawns. At this point, it's difficult to discuss a similar advantage for blacks. Despite having a 4-3 advantage on the queen side, they will struggle to create a passing pawn as easily as his opponent, because his pawns are still doubles. So, if all of the pieces are exchanged, and the endgame is entered with this pawn formation, i.e., the king-pawned endgame, the whites will be in a winning position. But, as we said, this scenario is the best scenario for the whites. The blacks, of course, won't allow it. However, taking away the opponent's casting rights is another advantage of the whites. Yes, because the queens are not on the board. The blacks may not have to worry as much. However, there are still enough pieces on the board to launch a strong attack, and even a mate attack. So the blacks should always be on their guard. The blacks' advantage, however, is the superiority of the bishop pair and their solid position. So, mentioning a weakness that is nearly achievable appears unlikely. With the king takes d8, Maxime Lagrave continued the game with a fairly standard h3 move. Of course, one advantage of this move is that it creates an escape route for king to h2 in the event of a possible situation. Simultaneously, after the exchanges, the unrivaled bishop of blacks remained a white bishop, and the h3 move was intended to restrict the white bishop as much as possible. In the future, the whites will use the g4 move to force the opponent's knight in the f5, which is currently active, into more passive squares. h3, and here we see the king e8 move once again, which is very standard for the blacks. The king e8 move not only avoids the opponent's open d verticals king tempos, but it also prepares the rook to move to d8 in the future. The blacks can exchange another rook, attempting to simplify and relax the position in their own way. Of course, it should be obvious that the sensitive f7 pawn will seek support in the near future. This task will be carried out by the king. With king e8, Maxime Lagrave continued his development with the knight c3 move. It is a very sensible developmental move. Of course, the question may arise at this point. Why didn't the whites immediately push the opposing knight into a more passive square with g4 when they could? I'm a player who likes to play the Berlin defense with the blacks. The early g4 move here will delight Berlin players. Because, for example, when the knight is withdrawn to the e7 square, with the rook's effectiveness and the support of the queen's bishop in c8, blacks may wish to weaken their opponent's pawn chain, with h5 advancing. So this can be described as a move played a little too early for the whites. Of course, the whites will want to do this g4 advance at some point during the game. But for the time being, we can say it's early. That's why knight c3. The whites simply continue to develop, and the king can go to the central square, where it can be effective. After knight c3, h5 move from Grischuk. Again, it's a very standard and well-known idea. First of all, the blacks gain a little more space away from the king side, which their opponent wishes to play, and prevent them from easily mobilizing the pawn multiplicity, controlling the g4 square in particular. As you can tell, one of the biggest problems of the blacks, especially because the king is in the e8 square, is that the rook is not able to join the game from the central verticals in the most natural way. I'm talking about the rook on h8. The blacks take a very creative approach to solving this problem, and while it is not currently possible, they can come up with the idea of moving their rook to squares where it can be effective from the sixth horizontal. The h5 is also a pawn advance. That makes it difficult for whites to advance g4, and is intended to keep the knight in the f5 indefinitely. Maxime Lagrave's development is complete with the bishop f4 move. Of course, the whites would want to do it, and perhaps the bishop f4 square is the best choice. At first glance, the development of the bishop from behind its own e5 pawn appears to have occurred on the incorrect square. However, the whites may have ideas to attack the e6 and c7 discovered attacks. With bishop f4, the rooks now face each other, and the whites have completed their development. But the blacks still have significant problems about it. That's why the blacks must be quick. Bishop e7. It's a logical square. He increased his support by gaining control of the g5 square, which could be useful in the future. Because we can see that the latest h5 pawn advance weakens the g5 square. Bishop e7. Maxime Lagrave continued the game with rook a d1. It shouldn't be too hard to see that the white rooks can be developed from the open and semi-open e and d center verticals. But it may be a little early to make the e6 move we just mentioned. On the contrary, it could have worked in favor of blacks, because that is how whites give up the e5 pawn, which gives them space supremacy. And with bishop takes e6, the blacks would develop the queen's bishop. Of course, the whites play bishop takes c7 at the end of the variant. But, as we said, blacks have a very important advantage in development. At the same time, with bishop takes c7, the whites exchanged their valuable central pawn for their opponent's c-pawn, and blacks eliminated the double pawn weakness. And it is no longer possible to discuss the whites' advantage of having a large number of pawns on the king's side. So, it is too early for e6. Bishop e7 versus rook a d1. Now, bishop e6. The blacks want to complete their development. At the same time, by placing the bishop in e6, he will not worry about the opponent's e6 advances. After bishop e6, keep in mind that the bishop in e6 is facing the a2 pawn. Now, Maxime Lagrave continues with knight g5. The whites did not play the bishop g5 before, because it could have been a move to take advantage of their opponent's bishop pair. But Because the whites wanted to use the g5 square for their knight, they developed their bishop from the f4 square. And with the knight g5, he may still be trying to take away his opponent's bishop pair advantage. At the same time, this will mean that the pawn structure for blacks is deteriorating. Here, we see the rook h6 response, which is a standard move used by blacks. As I said, I really enjoy playing the Berlin defense with the black pieces. Although the players don't often allow it, I'm familiar with the concept of rook h6 here. Although the rook seems to be putting itself in a pen because of the bishop in f4, for the time being, any discovered attack with the knight does not help the whites. That's why the blacks put their rook in the game, from h6 when they could. And if this rook can do it, it can put some nice pressure on the king side from g6 square. At the same time, one of the ideas is to counter the knight takes e6 with rook takes e6, without allowing the pawn structure to deteriorate. Now, rook f e1. The whites have finished their development and are now developing their rooks naturally from the central verticals. It's completely logical. But after the rook f e1 move, Grischuk continues to play with the bishop b4 move by presenting a well-known and very instructive idea in the Berlin defense. The blacks have played with their bishop for the second time, which may appear to be a loss of tempo at first glance. However, now that the whites have placed rook e1, the blacks have pinned the knight and their intentions are clear. With the bishop takes c3 move, they intend to weaken the opponent's pawn structure on the queen side, even if they give the bishop pair. And here, a move like rook d3 that would prevent this for the whites could be disrupted by bishop c4. So the whites continued with the a3 move by allowing that. Of course, one of the threats was to take the a2 pawn after bishop takes c3. That's why a3. But that way, the blacks may have countered the loss of tempo, because the a3 move is not a developmental move. Bishop takes c3. B takes c3, and as you can see, the blacks gave up the advantage of the bishop pair, but formed discrete double pawns on the queen side of their opponent. This endgame could be a huge advantage for the blacks. So the whites should definitely avoid the strategy of exchanging too many pieces. Keep as many pieces on the board as possible, and play a dynamic game. After the whites b takes c3 move, h4 from Grischuk. Once again, he gains more space than the king side his opponent wants to play, giving his opponent the opportunity to advance his comfortable g-pawn and mobilize those pawns. But Maxime Lagrave played g4 here. Maxime Lagrave played that position a lot against top-tier opponents in 2018 and 2019, and his choice was usually the knight e4 move. But in this game, he is playing the g4 move. Maxime Lagrave has played this move before. All right, after g4, the blacks played h takes g3 en passant, and the whites countered it with f takes g3. What did the whites get with these exchanges? The g3 and h3 pawns have now created the necessary conditions for the pawn multiplicity to be activated. Because, as we mentioned in the opening, blacks are no longer able to break the chain of whites. So, what did the blacks get? First of all, they open the H vertical and they have good pressure on the H3 pawn. Also, after the exchanges, there is no pawn in the F vertical, so the F5 pawn remains weak and discreet. This is how the Black's advantages can be measured. Both players in this position played very quickly until this position, the theory of which is well known. They didn't take their time. But Grischuk has now spent exactly 50 minutes on his knight e7 move, just for a single move. Grischuk was already having problems with time in many of his classic games, and I think he's enjoying it now. Knight e7. But that's a humorous approach. Grischuk must have analyzed the position deeply. With knight e7, he avoided his opponent's g4 tempos and may be wanting to move his knight to d5 square in the future. At this time, the h3 pawn is on demand. And here, Maxime Lagrave chose to protect the h3 pawn with the h4 move. At first glance, this advancement appears to violate the principle of former world champion Cuban Grandmaster Capablanca. Because what does Capablanca say? Place your pawns in squares that are opposite color of your bishop. Of course, Capablanca's principle is correct. But another principle is that if there are opposite colored bishops on the board, it is best to place your own pawns in squares of the same color as your own bishop. The reason is, the opposing bishop will never be able to attack those pawns. Of course, it varies depending on the position, and we'd seen the g4 move before in Lagrave's practice. So it shows us that both principles are true. His preference in this game is h4, but in doing so, the whites weakened the white squares even more. With h4, I'd like to say something before I forget. It's almost as if the whites are countering to the threat to h3 with a simpler solution. Knight takes e6. But knight takes e6, and after rook takes e6. What did we just say? White should avoid exchanging too many pieces. Because of pawn weakness in the endgame, this could clearly benefit the blacks. At the same time, after the knight and the black bishop were exchanged, when we look at the pieces that remained on the board, we can see that the black knight can perform better and more functional tasks than the white bishop. Because the bishop in f4 appears to be unaffected behind the e5 pawn. Blacks, for example, can continue with knight g6. For this reason, the black's knight e7 move is countered with h4. To take advantage of the space, the whites must keep a large number of pieces on the board. Now, knight d5. Now the threat is knight takes f4, g takes f4, and to take the h4 pawn, and also the c3 pawn. Here, the whites could counter both threats with bishop d2. This could be the first move we can think of. But Maxime Lagrave plays the bishop c1 move and sacrifices the c3 pawn. But, as we said, Maxime Lagrave is a player who has played this position countless times. And it appears that he has made special preparations for the candidates tournament. Well, knight takes c3. And now rook d3. Yes, The pawn sacrifice should now make sense. With the rook d3 move, by gaining tempo from the opponent's knight in c3, the goal is to quickly double the rook's f vertically. In a moment, with the rook f3 and rook f1, the whites will attack the f7 pawn. That's why the pawn sacrifice seems to make perfect sense. Now, knight a4. Again, after a long period of thinking, Grischuk decides on knight a4. While it doesn't seem logical to move the knight into the corner at first, it's Stockfish's first suggestion. Because when the blacks played knight d5, they were deprived of using the d5 square with their bishop. And they want to add this rook to the d vertical later. That's why knight a4. The whites have begun the plan to double the rooks we mentioned earlier with rook f3. After rook f3, Grischuk continues the game with the bishop d5 move. We've already mentioned that he wants to use the d5 square with his bishop. And Grischuk's goal here is to avoid giving his opponent time to double his rooks with rook f1. He demanded the rook right away. Rook f4. The whites are still preparing the rook f1 move, and they're doing it by gaining time, because the knight is on demand. Now, knight b6, and rook e f1. The whites' threat is knight takes f7. Although it appeared that the blacks would be unable to protect that pawn, Grischuk demonstrated that defense can be accomplished not only directly, but also by exploiting tactical opportunities with the rook g6 move. With the concept of a rook lift, the rook assists an active defense. If the whites made knight takes f7 here, rook takes g3 check, and no matter where the king was played, the rook g2 threats could have been a win position for the blacks. For this reason, against rook g6, rook f5. Whites are in no hurry to take the f7. With the rook f5 move, the bishop and rook ensure the knight's protection, and the whites want to mobilize the multiplicity. The goal is to advance h5 and get rid of the uncomfortable rook in the g6 and mobilize the pawns in front of the king more comfortably. Now, bishop c4. What did we say? Grischuk shouldn't give his opponent that opportunity. He immediately threatened to take the exchange once again. For this reason, rook e1. Here, you might ask the question, why didn't the whites continue their threat to take f2 by playing rook 1 f2? If they had done that, the blacks would have had a chance to create a significant counterplay with rook d8. The threat is rook d1, and to take the bishop in c1. If the whites had countered rook d8 with bishop d2, we can see that the whites cannot take the f7 pawn. Allow the blacks to make a waiting move, for example, a6. However, the knight takes f7 cannot be made, because against the bishop takes f7 and rook takes f7, the blacks are a very simple rook takes d2 deflection pattern. Rook takes d2, king takes f7, the blacks would be ahead in material. The blacks are always technically defending their position. For this reason, bishop c4 versus rook e1, without leaving the first horizontal and without giving the opponent a countergame opportunity. Now, Grischuk played king e7. It's an effective move. Of course, one idea behind the whites' rook e1 move is to attack the opposing king from the e vertical by advancing e6 at the right time. The whites' main strategy is to play from the king side and attack the opposing king anyway. The purpose of the king e7 move is to play rook h8 if the whites allow it, and to prevent the whites from mobilizing a larger number of pawns by advancing h5. Because if rook h8 is allowed, we see that with g4, h5 cannot be prepared. The h4 pawn would be left unprotected. That's why, against king e7, Maxime Lagrave immediately played h5. If the e6 move had been made here, the blacks would not have opened the e vertical. Instead, they would have countered by advancing f6. He was also going to demand the knight. So, king e7 versus h5, rook h6 versus g4. He protected the pawn. Now that Grischuk saw that his rock cannot be activated in any square from the 6th horizontal, he played the rook h8 again. And finally, the blacks made the connection between the rocks. But the whites have sacrificed a pawn against that. But they have a very important initiative. Maxime Lagrave now goes through a fairly long thought process and continues the game with the a4 move. The white pieces are all on the attack. The knight, the rook, the other rook, the bishop in c1 is the only piece not included in the attack. The a4 pawn sacrifice's purpose is to include the bishop in the attack from the a3 square. And knight takes a4. Beware, the blacks are planning that capture, so that if they can put up a good defense, they'll want to reward themselves with the far-passing pawn in the a7. And remember how important the a7 pawn will be. After knight takes a4, this is the moment of truth. Maxime Lagrave continued to play with the very natural bishop a3 check move. But here, we see the whites are missing a very important opportunity. You can stop the video and think about it. The whites could almost reach the winning position with rook e4. Of course, if the bishop moves to somewhere, the knight on a4 will be undefended. And please note that the bishop has to protect the f7 square. There are different continuations here. First, let's look at the b5 move against the rook e4. It looks like it's protected everything, but rook takes c4, a great exchange sacrifice. The goal is, of course, to capture the f7 pawn. When the blacks responded with b takes c4, rook takes f7, the whites were able to enter the opposing area that they had intended from the beginning of the game, and the king is also very weak. Of course, blacks will play king e8 here, because against d8, the knight e6 would come with gaining king's tempo. Against king e8, rook takes c7. The rook on the 7th horizontal is far more valuable than the exchange. Here, the blacks can't put up a proper defense, especially since the rooks can't cooperate. Of course, one of the threats the whites have is to take the g7 pawn and create two passing pawns. At the same time, imagine this. The knight is in e6, and when the bishop moves to g5, the whites can create the rook e7 mate pattern. Let's say the blacks have an active defense here. They played rook d8. Its goal is to move rook d1 and then capture the bishop. But bishop a3. Now, rook e7, king f8, knight e6 check, and rook takes g7. The whites are now demanding a checkmate. This cannot be allowed. The beauty of this idea is that it cannot be blocked by rook d7. Because rook c8. Now the blacks have to play rook d8. Against this, rook takes d8, king takes d8, and the knight f7 would take the rook with double attack, and the whites would have a material advantage. So, against bishop a3, the threat posed by rook e7 cannot be prevented by rook d7. Then let's say the c5 move is played. But there's a knight f7 move against that. Now there's a double attack, and he wants to take one of the rooks. Yes, the blacks have the rook d1 tempo. He can take his rooks out of the threat, but the king g2. With rook f8, king f2 would give the blacks an unnecessary countergame. The knight would be pinned. That's why the king g2 is safer. The rook d2 check is not going to make any sense for the blacks. The white king would be quite safe in g3 square. A little later, the white's threat of knight d6, and then maybe the rook c8, which the rook is already on demand, would have concluded the game quickly. Let's go back to rook e4. We've seen that the b5 move is not working. All right, let the blacks play knight b6. Defend their bishop with their knight. Against this, the rook takes c4 exchange sacrifice may not be so good, because after the knight takes c4, the bishop will not be able to join the attack from square a3 this time. So the attack can be started immediately with bishop a3. Of course, the king must protect the f7 square. So, king e8. The blacks seem to control everything, but knight takes f7. It's a move that breaks the king side. After bishop takes f7 e6, the bishop's only option is to go to g8. However, there is also the possibility of a rook f8 mate. That's why the blacks have to give up their bishop. Against bishop takes e6, rook takes e6. Let's say the blacks gave the bishop by taking the h5 pawn, reducing the number of pawns. However, it would be countered with rook e f4, and the threat would be to mate in 2 moves with rook f8. The blacks have no effective defense against this. If the knight returns to d7, the whites take the knight and then the bishop with the king's tempo, and they have a material advantage. So, against rook e4, knight b6 does not appear to be a viable option. So, let's take a look at the most resilient bishop e6 move for blacks. He demands the rook. If the whites play rook takes a4, bishop takes f5, g takes f5, now the h5 pawn can also be taken. The blacks would have won the exchange, and a lot of pawns against knight and bishop. There wouldn't be much left of the whites' attack. For this reason, bishop e6. The whites could not take the undefeated knight, and would instead play the knight e6. Now, blacks don't have time to capture it with the king, because rook takes a4 would be the answer. That's why f takes e6, demanding the rook in f5. There's no time to take the knight, but against that, bishop g5 check. And of course, the rook f7 should not be allowed, so king e8, and rook f3. Now the whites want to capture the knight. Let's just say the blacks escape their knight by gaining time with c5 tempo. Against that, there's the rook ef4 move, the idea of doubling rooks that we're familiar with. Once again, we see the agony of the rooks that are separated from each other. The white's threat of rook f7 and rook in 7th horizontal, combined with the threats of rook e7, could have been the finisher. So, in all of the variants we've analyzed, the rook e4 move is very close to winning. However, as you can see, the whites had to see 3 continuations examples, and the continuations within them, in order to enter this variant. Especially the knight takes f7 sacrifice. So it would not be right to criticize Maxime Lagrave. I'm guessing Maxime Lagrave could see his rook e4 move at 9 for 10. But the stress of the candidates tournament also affects the players. Instead of rook e4 here, Maxime Lagrave continued with bishop a3. The black's latest move was a knight takes a4. Now, after the bishop takes a3 check, the blacks are back in the game. c5. He's blocking the threat. From now on, it leads to forced moves. e6. He both demanded the f7 pawn and c5 pawn. Of course, the blacks can't let the center too open. With f6, he both defended the f7 pawn and demanded the knight with an economical defense. Bishop takes c5 check. Knight takes c5. Rook takes c5. F takes g5. And now the important rook takes c7 intermediate check move. Rook takes c7. Now king d6. And rook takes c4. So the whites have reclaimed the pawns they sacrificed and are now putting pressure on the blacks. But this double rook pawn endgame is close to a draw. Grischuk, on the other hand, is still having issues with time. He's already putting in a lot of time on a lot of moves. He only has about a minute left, and we're only on the 35th move. But Grischuk was a World Blitz champion and a great blitz player in his day. After rook takes c4, a5, what did we just say? The far-passing pawn of the blacks will be the draw's insurance. Even if he doesn't move, the rook in the opening square brilliantly supports the passing pawn from behind, as Tarash pointed out. Rook d1 check, and king e7. Of course, taking the e6 pawn here would have exposed the king too much. Grischuk is already experiencing shortage of time. He doesn't have enough time to calculate them. That's why, against rook d1, we're seeing the safe king e7 move. Grischuk's goal here is to use the opponent's e6 pawn for defense purposes, while keeping the e-vertical closed. Now, rook e4. Of course, you might still have this question. Why not the rook d7? But against that, blacks can play king takes e6, because it's previously stated, the rook cannot pose a check threat from afar, and the black king saves time by demanding the rook. For example, let's assume that after king takes e6, rook takes b7, and a4 is played. The whites keep taking pawns. Rook takes g7, a3, rook takes g5, a2. Why am I showing this variant? Even if the whites capture all the pawns, the blacks have a promotion threat after one move. According to the machine here, whites still have a chance to draw with perpetual check, but that is the best case scenario for whites. In the rook d7 check, king takes e6, rook takes b7, and a4 variation. Assume the whites do not capture the pawns and instead attempt to stop the pawn. For example, with the rook b4 move, the blacks will play a3 again. Against rook a4, the blacks don't have to exchange rooks and leave the a vertical to the opponent. They can continue with any move and play a2. So we can see the passing pawn on the a-line is the insurance of the draw, the counter game. That's why against the latest king e7 move from the blacks, the whites didn't play rook d7 check. They played rook e4 first. Now that the pawn is protected, the rook d7 check can be really dangerous. So, Grischuk catches up in time and plays rook h d8. Of course, once one rook is exchanged, the black king is assured that it will not be checkmated. The whites are keeping two rooks in play to keep the pressure on. Rook b1. Now, the b7 pawn is on demand. Rook d b8. While he seems to be passively defending, he wants to play b5. So, rook b5, given the g5 pawn. But Grischuk doesn't care. a4. After the rook takes g5 and rook g8, there is no need to risk the position. The g7 pawn has been defended. We've reached the 40th move. Players were given an extra 50 minutes. Now that there is no effective way to stop the a4 pawn, the blacks have managed to stabilize their position. Of course, Lagrave is very passive. He doesn't want to stop the pawn with the rook e1, rook a1. So, in order to take the a4 pawn at the end of the variation, he plays h6. Actually, it's a draw offer. We'll see. Of course, the g7 pawn is on demand, and the black's g takes h6 move is mandatory. Rook takes g8, rook takes g8, rook takes a4, and Lagrave is finally free of this dangerous pawn. Now, h5. The pinned pawn is on demand. King f2, getting out of the pin. Rook takes g4, rook takes g4, h takes g4, king g3, king takes e6, king takes g4, and this game is a draw. The players played a little bit more. King e5 from Grischuk, king f3 from Lagrave. The white king can protect the pawn just in time. King d4, king e2, king c3, king d1, b5, king c1, b4, king b1, b3, c, b, king b, and the game ends in a draw because of the insufficient material. Who says Berlin defense is boring? Here's the Berlin defense. A great challenge, a missed opportunity. Let's see if Maxime Lagrave misses his half point at the end of the tournament. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to this channel. And click on the bell icon to stay updated with my new videos. Hope to see you in the next videos. Take care.